Hello everybody and welcome back to part 4 of our new tool Airfix 172 scale Vulcan build. You'll remember in the last part, in part 3, we assembled the lower wing panels and fitted the internal reinforcing structure, did the bomb bay and the wheel well bays. In this video I want to get the intakes made up. Airfix provide these as a lower and upper halves with a splitter in the front, so there's quite a lot of seam work to do, and I want to build my intakes seamless, but I'm not going to be using the FOD covers, so you're going to be able to see right the way down to the engine faces. I want to make a good job of getting the filling done and making those as seamless as possible. The technique that I'll be using is really to paint the two halves of the intakes first, and then assemble them and then reinforce them using Milliput superfine white filler. I've had a really good result with that on previous intakes where the intakes are white. It's not a method that a lot of people use, but as I say, I've had good results with that, and I'll explain how I go about it when we get over to the bench and put these intakes together. Hopefully we'll get to the stage of being able to install the intakes into the wing panels and fit the upper wing to the lower. So basically I have the majority of the fuselage assembled by the end of this part. So the first job to do is obviously to get on with those intakes, so we'll get over to the bench, get the parts for the intakes out, and we'll make a start on them.
Right, so the first job up today is to get these intakes sorted out. And the first thing I did when I looked at these on the sprue was to just number them up. I think that's a bit of overkill really, because I don't think these could be assembled incorrectly. There are two halves, which are the top halves, with this bar across, I think, which will locate it into the wing. So obviously we've got port and starboard and the matching undersides, and you'll be able to see here that I've already fitted the splitter into the lower side of the intake. And again, it's just as well to be careful with the numbering of these before you take them off the sprue. Just do them one at a time. It would be possible, I think, to get these in on the wrong side if you didn't take care with the numbering. So I just removed them from the sprue one by one and made sure that they went in the right side. Once they're located in the bottom part of the intake, it's fairly obvious which way up these splitters go, because you might be able to see there from the angle that it sits at that it's slightly flared down to one side, down to outboard. So it would be difficult to fit it the other way around. If you looked at it from front on, it just wouldn't be sitting correctly in the intake. But even so, it's just worth taking a bit of care with these and making sure that they go in the right place, and also that you fit them. The fit is a little bit sloppy with them, so just adjust them to make sure that you're going to be doing the minimum amount of sanding here where it joins into the intake itself. And I did that by just locating the top half of the intake before I applied any glue to this splitter inside, and just got it into the right position and just applied a little bit of glue to the bottom. Not too much, otherwise you'll end up having capillary action take the glue up and into the top half of the splitter and gluing it to the top part of the intake assembly, which we don't want at this stage. We want to keep them separate. So having fitted the splitters, I just want to do a bit of filling on this bottom half. Obviously when you're looking into these intakes, you'll see the bottom half a little bit more than you will the top, so it's just as well to make a really good job of the bottom half, and it's easier to do that with the assembly open, with the intakes open. On the starboard assembly, I found a little bit of a gap. I didn't with the port, but with the starboard I had a little bit of a gap here at the back of the splitter, and I've just packed that out with some thin plastic sheet and trimmed it off. And that's because I used plastic sheet there because I wanted a strong bond at this point, and just leaving it to filler might not have done the job. That's a lot stronger than using filler. I'll go in now and fill the resulting gap, but the plastic card just helps give us a stronger bond there. And again, that's been check fitted with the top half of the intake in place. So I'll just sort these splitters out, and for that I'm using some Mr. Surfacer 1200. This will need probably more than one coat. This is fairly thin. But if we just go around the top of the bottle where it's thickened up a little bit, that's a bit more effective. I'll just leave that to dry up a little bit and do the other side. It's little jobs like this that just mark this out as an Airfix kit, by which I mean, if you imagine someone like Tamiya producing this kit, I don't really believe that we'd be doing this filling on a part like this. But then again, would Tamiya produce a 172 scale Vulcan? I doubt it. So you can see there the Mr. Surfacer just around the bottom edge of that splitter join. I suppose strictly speaking, the splitter is the panel that goes on the inboard side of the intakes. This just separates the airstream into the two engines on each side of the aircraft. So I'll just leave that to set up for a little while. Because I've put so much on there, it's quite a thick application in some places. You'd have to leave that to dry for a while. If not, all you'll do is, when you come to sand it, all you'll do is pull it out of the joints. So make sure it's fully set before we do any more on that. The other part that we're going to need for these intakes obviously are the engine faces, which are these parts here. And the numbering of those 10 and 11 suggests that they go to one side only. They're not interchangeable, and helpfully Airfix have put the numbers of the engine on the reverse of the engine faces, so we're not going to get those mixed up. I'm just looking at these engine faces. This is the Starboard Intake, so it's engines 3 and 4. So obviously that fits, but strangely enough so does 1 and 2. So I'm not sure about that, but we'll do as we're told anyway. We'll put them on the right, we'll put them on the intake that they're intended for, and it might be possible if we shine a light down there, you might be able to see them at the bottom of the intake. They'll look nice when they're painted in an aluminium colour or a metallic steel colour. These intakes on the Vulcan were very distinctive, and the shape of them was the cause of the famous Vulcan howl, which was the sound that the aircraft made at full throttle. And it's a sound that many of us will have heard at air shows and the like, or will have had first-hand experience of the aeroplane working on it. and it's the sound that I've got at the beginning of these videos. It's unmistakable, and we'd get pretty close to that sound when we'd replace the engines on these aeroplanes and had to go and test them, obviously out on the airfield, which at one stage involved a full throttle power up, just to check for fuel leaks and to make sure that the systems were working all right. And when you're standing a couple of meters underneath an Olympus at full throttle, it makes your bones shake, believe me. There were a few things that were advisable when you did that. The first was to make sure that the brakes were on and the wheels were chocked, and the second was to make sure you had your ear defenders in, otherwise your eardrums would have been at the other side of the airfield. So that's the Vulcan intake and the reason for the famous Vulcan howl. So I'm going to do the first rub down on these splitters, I'm going to call them for the sake of the videos. So to sand these intakes, I'm just rolling up a little piece of wet and dry, and I'll use that wet. It just reduces the burn on the plastic. So this will take more than one application of Mr. Surfacer. Maybe two. We might get away with two, but probably more likely 3 or 4. It might not be possible to see that because of the colour of the Mr. Surfacer, but there's quite a lot in this area here, so I've got the splitter a little bit low in the lower part of the intake. But you've got to find a balance with these because it isn't a perfect fit, and you've just got to decide where you want to do the filling and sanding. And it's easier to do this bottom joint whilst you've got the intakes open. So that's after the first application of Mr. Surfacer. It's not too bad. I got a good fit, particularly on this port side. But it does need another application just here at the front. But it's looking good. It's not bad for a first application. So I'll just do another one and let that dry again. The second application, we'll leave that to dry thoroughly for probably an hour or so, and we'll come back and finish that up. So this has had 2 coats of the Mr. Surfacer brush applied and sanded down. So the next step is to go in with the Airbrush. This is Harder and Steenbeck Infinity with a 0.4 nozzle, and I've loaded it with some Mr. Surfacer 1000 reduced 50% with Mr. Hobby levelling thinners, and this will act basically as a primer, so we'll be able to see if there's any work still to be done by giving this a primer coat. So that coat has revealed that there's still more work to do on the bottom edge of these. The sides are okay, but we need to go in again with another coat of the Mr. Surfacer applied with a brush, just to get some more coverage on there. So again, leave that to dry and see how we've done next time. Okay, so I've been back in with these now and given them a final coat of Mr. Surfacer, reduced through the airbrush and sprayed on. and that's given us the sort of finish that I wanted on the bottom part of the splitters. So the gaps have disappeared now and they're good to go. I've also given an overall coat of Mr. Surfacer primer as a primer on the top surfaces of the intakes as well. Okay, so I'm just going to go through my approach to painting these intakes. They need to be white for the majority of them, but on the Vulcan the camouflage scheme extended into the intake, both top and bottom, for a fair distance really. And the usual way of painting this would be to assemble it at this stage, do all the filling work, so the sides of the intakes, all four sides, and the top of the splitter here to match where we've done the filling on the bottom of the splitter. So with all that filling work done, you would then have to paint the white and the camouflage once the filling's been done. The difficulty with that is trying to paint a fairly long intake with an airbrush, because the paint's obviously entering at a very acute angle, and it's not easy using that sort of technique to get a smooth finish and consistent finish all the way through the intake. You would then have to mask that white off using the templates that Airfix provide, and I'll come back to those in a moment. You would mask the white off and paint the camouflage, but that's a lot of tricky airbrush work. But I'm going to take a slightly different approach with this, and what I've done is I've pegged the intakes together and I've gone in with this rolled up piece of wet and dry just to take off the high spots on the splitter, both sides. So what that means is that when I come to assemble this, I'm not going to have to do any sanding. All I'm going to be doing is filling gaps, because all the sanding's doing is removing high spots, and we've done that to a dry assembly. So when we come to put these together again, we won't have any high spots, and hopefully that'll reduce the amount of sanding that we need to do to a painted surface. And that's because I'm going to be keeping these parts open, and I'm going to paint them white whilst they're open, and that'll enable me to get a nice even consistent finish all the way through the intake from front to back on both parts. And then, having done that, join them together, glue them together, and deal with all the seam work, which will just be gaps rather than high spots, using some Milliput Superfine white, which is removable using water, so an awful lot less messy than sanding, and hopefully that'll give a nice consistent smooth finish all the way down the intake. Because I'm doing the white first, I'm not going to be able to use these templates in the Airfix instructions, because these cover the camouflaged area. So their intention is that you paint the camouflage scheme at the front of the intake, mask them off using these templates, and then spray the white behind. And I think that's problematic, because what you will be painting here is a camouflage scheme consisting of a fairly dark green, RAF dark green, and a grey colour. So there's quite a contrast between the two colours, and you will be having that contrast, that demarcation here where you're going to be painting the white. And that means that you're going to have to apply quite a bit of white paint in order to hide that demarcation. And I don't want to apply all that white paint, it's going to start making a mess. So what I'll be doing is, as I've said, paint the intakes white, get them all cleaned up and filled, and then I will use these templates to cut this mask, so the reverse or the shadow mask, using these templates, and then that will cover the white. I'll then be able to paint the camouflage scheme. So hopefully that will work. I've not tried it before doing it that way, but it's a useful experiment. I'll see how it goes. Right, so I've painted these intakes in the white, and I've got a nice even coverage of the colour all the way through the intakes. The difficulty with this method is that it's important to get the same coverage of the white paint top and bottom, and sometimes at a distance it looks as though, when you've got the parts separated, it looks as though you've got the same amount of paint on, but when you put them together there's a colour difference between the two halves, top and bottom. So what I did was just loosely assembled them and just airbrushed in the areas where you can really see the colour, particularly on this inboard face here, just to make sure that the white's balanced up top and bottom. And I also checked that the top of the splitter was in the right paint density as well. So they're all nicely matched up now, and I can put them together. I'll glue them today and leave them at least 24 hours to dry before I come and do any more work on them, which will be just doing the filling. So I'll put those together now. The first thing I want to do is clean off the paint, the white paint, from the mating surfaces, and that's just to get a good bond. It might appear that the polystyrene cement will burn through the paint surfaces, but it doesn't always, and it's just good practice, I think, to make sure that the joining surfaces are free of paint, and that just makes sure that the glue works effectively. Just making sure that I get through the primer coats, because the primer is a very similar colour to the underlying plastic. So as soon as we get down to the plastic underneath, we just leave it. I don't want to lower this or alter its shape, it's just to get rid of the paint. This lacquer paint that I'm using, this is matte white, but it actually dries to a very nice sheen, which I remember being representative of the colour of these intakes, or the finish on these intakes. I'll take something a bit coarser, that's not really cutting. The other benefit of using a coarser sanding stick on these joints is that it just roughs the join up a tiny little bit, which just gives the glue a little bit extra to bite into. Because if these seams open up again when they're in the aeroplane, you're not going to be able to repair them really. So we've got to make sure that they're going to stay together. When I'm cleaning the paint, I want to make sure that the paint's off this front face of the splitter, because that is a glue surface onto the top half of the intake. I just want to remember to remove the paint from the inside face where the top of the splitter joins. Just inside there. So that's a really nice fit and ready for some glue. I don't want to put too much glue on this because I don't want it oozing onto the inside faces of the intakes and spoiling the paint finish. So I'll just put some spots and use some extra thin Tamiya cement just to run into the joints. And if we're careful, that should leave a nice clean joint, but a nice strong one as well. And I might reinforce this with some little bands of plastic sheet, but we'll see how it goes together first.
gently does it. And I'll go in now with the extra thin. This is the quick setting extra thin, and I want to get that tab at the back, the locating pin. Don't want to flood these because the cement will run through the joint, and it could run through to the paint finish that I've got inside, so I don't want that to happen. So that's a good result. That's gone together. I've got a good join all the way along, and none of the cement has come through onto the paint surface inside. So that's all good. Now I would like to get some reinforcing styrene just on the outside of these intakes, just to strengthen the join that I've got there and stop it opening up. But before I do that, I just want to make sure that adding styrene to these intakes from the outside isn't going to spoil the fit. So we'll just move that to one side. So that's the location of the intake on the lower wing. It's a really nice fit actually. Airfix have done a great job with these intakes. And we can see that adding some plastic strip here and along this side and all the way down here to this beam isn't going to affect anything. I'm not going to be able to put any on the back, right at the back here, because that will just interfere with the fit up against this Bombay bulkhead here. I just want to mark where I need to avoid. And also when the wheel bay fits in here, this will go pretty close to the intake as well. So I'm going to avoid just that back 8 or 9 millimeters, but I can reinforce the rest. And I'll feel happier then about the strength of that joint. And the fit into the top wing won't be problematic either. There's plenty of room around there to get the reinforcers in. So I just want to find some suitable strip for these reinforcing bands, and I'll probably use this one. It's thin enough. It's a 0.01 by 0.08, and that's the last piece of that, so I better get some more. So this will be flexible enough to go around the curvature of the intake. So I'm going to be fitting it something like that, like a reinforcing band. Okay, time to do some filling on these intakes. They've set up quite nicely overnight, so they're nice and solid now. These reinforcing strips hopefully have done a better job than just leaving the joint plain. So let's see. So I've got some Milliput Superfine White, and I think we'll need quite a bit of this, but I might mix 2 batches, one for each intake. It does go quite a long way, but I don't really want to run out halfway through the job. I want to be able to smooth it all at once, just to make sure that it's all okay. One thing about Milliput is when you read the instructions, it actually tells you to mix it for, I think it's 7 minutes, which is quite a long time really, and I'm sure that a lot of people don't do that. But When you're done, it can take an awful long time to go off. Mixed properly, it should be set within a few hours really. And as I said, I'm not going to be sanding this anyway, or hopefully not. So it doesn't really matter that it's going to take a while to set, because I'll just be smoothing it with water, probably with a cotton bud or a cocktail stick, and hopefully we shouldn't be doing any sanding. So I'm not going to keep you for 7 minutes watching me mix some milliput, so we'll just skip forward. Okay, so I think that will be enough. So we'll start to get some on these intakes now. Just start from the back. So just work the milliput into the join. It's quite a long way down there to reach right to the end. Or to reach halfway, obviously you can do it from both ends. And then once you've got some in, you can always add a bit more, but I just take the excess off with a damp cotton bud. I want to get into the top section here where the splitter is at the top. So that's just a dampened cocktail stick there, just to get the excess off and smooth it in a bit more easily. Sometimes, particularly when the milliput starts to go off a little bit, it can be just a little bit stiff and hard to get into the gaps that you're trying to fill. So just a bit of moisture on the cocktail stick just helps to smooth it in a little bit. This may need a second application, but we'll see. It might not. So this is quite time consuming to do this, but it wouldn't look right really having these gaps, particularly on this face that I'm doing now. This is quite exposed and very visible on the finished model, so it needs sorting out properly. So nearly there, at least for this first intake. I've obviously got the other one to do. Using the white milliput here helps when you just want to touch up the white paint. Obviously if you use the grey variety, and I also think there's a terracotta milliput as well that you can get, but they would obviously alter the contrast and you'd have to put a lot more paint on to get the intake to be white again. And this superfine milliput's really good for getting a nice smooth finish. And this lacquer paint from Tamiya is pretty tough as well. It doesn't scratch that easily. It's fairly hard when it's properly set. So it can take this work after it's been painted. The front lip of this intake is going to need blending into the front of the wing anyway. So I'll get this bit at the front when I come to do that overall filling. I'll just get it as close as I can now. Okay, so that's not too bad at all for a first application. There's just one or two areas just at the top of the splitter there where it's just a bit low, and I'm going to have to put another piece in, another bit of milliput in, but there's no point doing it now because I might as well just let that dry. It'll give a base for the next level coat, and I'll just come in and finish that join off. It's good on the other side, and at the top. The seams at the side have disappeared, or they will under a coat of paint anyway. And this very prominent seam here I've got rid of as well. And you can see how using the milliput, the white milliput, just blends it in with the paintwork. And there's going to be no sanding required with this, so I'm not going to disturb the paintwork, and they'll look nice when they're in the aeroplane. So I'll do the other one now, and we'll just leave that to dry for a good few hours before coming and just doing some touch-ups with the milliput and getting them finally finished off. So that's the first application of milliput on both intakes, and they're not looking bad. Just a little bit more work. I'll let them dry thoroughly and come back, just do a little bit more touch-up with the milliput, quick spray of paint just to fill them in a little bit, and they'll be good to go, ready to fit into the model. Now, while we're waiting for those to dry, I'm going to go back to the engine faces, which I primed a couple of days ago. So we'll get those painted up now, ready to go in the back when these intakes are dried up. And I'm going to start with a coat of matte black on those, just as a base coat, and then I'll dry brush the aluminium or steel colour onto the engine faces, and let's see how that turns out. So I'm going to be using some Mr. Colour super metallic paint. These are really fine pigment metallics. This is Super Stainless 2. So presumably to represent stainless steel. So I just want to dry brush the faces of these engines. So this is a great brush for dry brushing, really old, and just go at this really slowly. There's no need to rush at it, and it looks to start with as though there's absolutely nothing going on. So that's one of the engine faces dry brushed. I just want to check it. I'm not convinced that that's going to look right. There's a bit too much black in that for my liking. So they're just a bit dark really. I'm going to lighten those up. I'll try a different method. What I'm going to do is spray them in the stainless steel and then put a dark wash in just to accentuate the blades, and I think that'll just brighten the effect up. You'll be able to see them a bit better down at the bottom of the intake, because they're just black at the moment, more or less. So we'll give that a go as an alternative. So what I'm going to do with this is give it a coat of overall stainless steel through the airbrush, but just hit the front face so that we retain the black shadows from the black undercoat, and hopefully that'll give us a better result down the intake. We'll be able to see them a bit more clearly. So for metallics, I'm very fortunate that I've got 3 airbrushes actually, and I reserve one. This one, it's a Badger Renegade. I reserve it just for metallics, and that's because it's very difficult to clean metallics out of an airbrush. What you find often is that you think you've got it perfectly clean, you've flushed it through 2 or 3 times, and when you come to do a top coat of a solid colour, you get the little flakes of metallic paint in your top coat. So this is kept exclusively for metallics. and obviously that's a very privileged position to be in, and I know that not everybody has the ability to do that. But if you don't, just make sure that the airbrush is perfectly clean after a coat of metallics, because it will come through into solid top coats if you don't clean it properly. So let's try and get these engine faces to look something like, and I'm just hitting them straight on so that it preserves the black shadows that I've already painted on. So I think they'll look a bit better down the intakes. We'll just give them a check now. Okay, so I'm happy now with these intakes. They've had 4, maybe 5 coats of paint. Each coat very lightly sanded down with some 1200 grit wet and dry, rolled up like that, so it just enables you to get in and smooth all the join lines. You can go on forever just painting and sanding, but I'm going to call time on that. I'm happy enough with it as it is. The splitters are nicely blended in. I've got the main seam here nice and smooth. This is the one that you're going to see the most of. And I'm just going to leave those now for 3 or 4 days to fully harden before I use the Airfix masks that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. So these, I've photocopied these so that I'm not cutting into the instructions, and I'll use these to mask off the upper and lower surface camouflage inside the intakes when I'm convinced that this white's fully hardened. Otherwise, putting masking tape on and burnishing it, when you take it off you can mar the paint surface if it's not fully hardened. And that will take 2 or 3 days easily to fully dry. So I've not got on quite as far as I'd hoped. I wanted to get these intakes fitted. You can see here what a good fit they are to the Airfix lower wing. And we'll just have that seam to clean up around. And I also want to spend some time making sure that I've got the correct holes drilled out for these panels which go on the underside of the engine exhausts. And Airfix offer alternatives for these panels. I think there were countermeasures panels, electronics. I don't recall them on the aircraft that we worked on. They were probably removed before coming down to us. But as I said, Airfix offer 3 alternatives. I'm not going to use the one with the blade aerial on the underside. At the time I'm modelling XL392, these were the 2 plates that were fitted. So I've got those ready. And there are other bits and pieces to do with these wing panels before they're joined. I want to make sure that I've got the air brakes nice and smoothed in. I've already gone ahead and done the port air brakes on the top here, and they needed a bit of work to do, so in the next part I'll fit the other air brakes and show you how I go about doing that. There are a few more sink marks that I need to do some work with, at the back particularly, but also the front of the fuselage here needs quite a bit of work with sink marks. You can see them with the naked eye, so they'll certainly show up under a coat of paint, so we'll have our work cut out to get those sorted out. And of course we've got the wheelbase to fit. They're all ready to go in, they can be fitted. But that's as much as I'm going to do for this particular episode. Not as far as I'd hoped, but it's progress nevertheless. These intakes are probably the biggest piece of work that you've got to do if you want to get a nice finish on them. An easy shortcut, of course, is to fit the FOD covers, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be able to look down and see the engine faces on these. So there we go. And that's my approach. It's not the approach that everybody will want to take. It's possible, as I said at the beginning, to just assemble these, glue them together and try and get the paint in nice and even. I think it's very difficult to get these painted smoothly with them assembled, so I'm happier with the approach I've taken on those. So that's it for this one, everybody. I hope that it's been useful seeing how I've done those intakes. I know that it's not the way that everybody will go about building them, but I've got a decent result with them doing it the way that I did. And hopefully next time we'll be able to crack on and get these wings sorted out, and then I think the pace of the build will pick up a little bit. So thanks for joining me for part 4. I hope that you've picked up something, particularly those of you, I know that a lot of you are building the Airfix kit, and I hope that you're enjoying it as much as I am. It's going together really nicely, and I'm happy with how it's turning out. So I'll be cracking on with that work over the next 2 or 3 days, and hopefully I'll be publishing an update in part 5, probably midweek, when we've got that main assembly sorted out. So I hope you can join me for that one. In the meantime, everybody, enjoy your modelling, particularly if you're building this lovely new kit from Airfix, and I'll see you in another 2 or 3 days. So bye for now.